He preached a sermon to the birds because no one else would listen to it. He inspired an entire generation of people to seek God in nature. He had a vision on a mountain that changed the world forever, hid from his father who did not want him to go into the ministry. We're talking about St. Francis of Assisi, a man who I guess could only be described as failing upwards because he just wanted a quiet, solitary life of renunciation. And instead, people kept giving him things that he couldn't give away fast enough to help other people. May we all fail as well as St. Francis of Assisi. Let's talk about that today as we walk together down creation's path. Hello, everyone. My name is Charlie. I am a Christopagan druid and priest of Bridget.
Hello, I'm Brian. I'm a Christopagan druid, sous chef to the Dada. My favorite thing is God told him to rebuild my church, and then he did it. And God's like, not that one, silly, the church. And he definitely helped hold it up. Fortunately, the church listened to him after much consternation and resistance because the Imperial Church do what the Imperial Church do.
The Franciscans only have an order because the Pope had nightmares that if he did not approve the second draft of the rule that Francis sent to him, that the church itself would collapse and be destroyed. So yeah, there's some divine intervention going on there.
I love looking at that because if you think about it, like it becomes a fun what-if exercise. What if the whole church, as the Imperial Church, had actually adopted and modified some of those? It's quite possible they would have already addressed a lot of the 95 Thesis issues and stuff that came later. Like a lot of the schisms may not have schismed as much. Some of it's going to happen anyhow because it was politics and imperialism doing what it do, but it becomes an interesting what-if exercise.
What if the world had listened to St. Francis when he was alive? That's a question. But before we get into it, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, follow, whatever the button is on the app that you're listening to us on, because we do new original Christopagan and Druidic content every day, and you don't want to miss anything, especially with Samhain coming up. We have a lot of really juicy stuff on the docket. You don't want to miss a thing. I've actually thought a lot about what if people had listened to Francis.
I feel like that question needs to come with a warning. I have gotten Franciscans in trouble in the past, made them late for prayers because I got them caught up in the conversation on that. Remember, set an alarm or a timer so you're not late for prayers and get yourself into trouble. It was with the Berkeley order, a couple of the members who got into a conversation hours past, they got phone called. Where are you and what happened? Because they were supposed to be running some simple errands. Deep, profound questions happen. Like, I'm pretty sure they weren't in trouble, but they had to answer for that.
St. Francis has what I like to think about as the Jesus problem, in that people pay attention to some of the events of his life, but don't listen to a thing he said. We don't have to speculate all that much about what he said because, unlike a lot of teachers from antiquity, we have writings directly from him. We have prayers that he wrote. We have letters that he wrote. We have his admonitions. We have actual writings from Francis, so we don't have to speculate on what he thought about various things. The more I have read Francis over the years, the more convinced I am that most people who talk about their love of St. Francis have maybe read the Canticle of the Creatures, and that's it. If even that.
If even that, yeah.
I think that they don't understand the pun of why Francis always has a dog by his foot, because in Latin, to say Francis's dog, you would say Franciscanus, which the monks that followed after his rule were called Franciscans or Franciscanus. So, oh, look, it's a pun. It's Francis and his dog. It's a Latin pun that gets put into the iconography, or they know about him talking to the birds. And he gets associated with this kind of touchy-feely saint that is only about the animals. And the only time you really ever hear Francis get brought up is we're having a blessing of the animals this weekend because it's the Feast of St. Francis, which is why we're doing this episode right now, because the Feast of St. Francis is here. But Francis is our Seraphic father, and he's called this because of a very profound vision he had. Francis is the first person in recorded history to have the stigmata. He received the stigmata when he was up on a mountain praying, and he had a vision of Christ crucified on a cross made of 6 angelic wings, 2 wings going up, 2 wings going down, and 2 wings out to the side. And he saw Christ crucified on these angelic wings, and light shined from the wings of Christ onto his body in the same places on his own body. And Francis had the stigmata from that point on. This to me is heavy symbolism, because Francis had pretty much the same mission that Jesus did. He was trying to help the poor, the needy, the destitute, the sick, the tired. He was trying to help us to see our connection to all of humanity, all of nature, and all of the world. I hear so many people talk about Francis and his love for the animals, but he gives us the language that I use regularly when I talk about our brother sun or our sister moon. I'm doing that because of Francis. When I talk about our sister bodily death, that's from the canticle of the sun. He puts us into this communion with all of nature, from fire and water and wind and earth, sky, and the whole thing, and helps us to connect to all things. He had a mysticism that embraced all of reality and all of life, and gave us 2 of the greatest saints in history that followed him. That would be Saint Bonaventure, who I have great love for, and Saint Anthony of Padua, who I also have great love for. Saint Anthony can help you in almost everything. One of his miracles was saving Saint Bonaventure's life when he was a child. Saint Francis' miracles. But I don't think we really think about the ramifications of the message that Francis brought. The whole point of his teachings and his life is that we have to start seeing the world as family. You can see that in that initial wave of Franciscans that came after him. When we're talking about St. Bonaventure or St. Anthony, we get to see this in 2 very different ways. St. Bonaventure takes us very much into academia and gives us these very philosophical treatises of the mind's journey into God and the tree of life and what have you. These very erudite explorations of the seed that Francis planted. Whereas St. Anthony just continues Francis's work, going around from place to place and town to town preaching. And somehow, and this is how you can always tell when empire gets its claws into something, it was the Franciscans who did the missions in the Americas that tortured and killed the native population, that enslaved the native population. It was the Franciscans and the Jesuits that led that colonizing imperial effort. And I cannot imagine anything further from the heart of St. Francis. But empire will have its way, and it corrupted the heart of the order.
This is why I think it's so important to take the time to actually read into those things, especially when you find that initial spark of interest. Because when you read deeper, you learn, like Francis's teachings, they were in direct contradiction there. And it becomes easier to sort out what is the imperial influence versus what is actually Franciscan. Because it's easy for somebody who has been harmed by that imperial influence to go, oh, Franciscans are bad because they colonized. And that's actually in contradiction to Francis's teaching. So though the imperial elements that influenced the Franciscan order at that time colonized, that's where that source comes from. That's the actual source when you trace it back, when you read through the readings.
I have struggled for years because I want to write a commentary on the rule of St. Francis, but the rule of St. Francis itself forbids commentaries to be written about it.
Which on some levels, makes complete sense, especially because in Francis's time, there was such a strong imperial influence going on. That was something that he struggled against. At least I feel very firmly and soundly in going, that's where that came from, was to try to say, no, imperial influence, stay out of this.
One of the most interesting things in the rule and in his teachings itself is this interesting nuance on obedience, because obedience is something that monks were encouraged to have in their rules. Obedience, chastity, the like. Francis's version of obedience is obedience first to your conscience. If a superior tells you to do something that violates your conscience, you are under no obligation to do it. This is very much different than what you see in other monastic rules, and is something that I feel like, especially those Franciscans of the colonizing and conquest periods, either had no conscience or didn't follow, because there is no excuse. Well, let me say it this way. There's no excuse ever to say I was just following orders, but especially as a Franciscan, there is no excuse to say I was just following orders.
Well, because part of the orders is also that communion, that relationship, and spending time building that relationship with God and listening to the still small voice and nurturing that and building that up. To be a Franciscan, that means they weren't doing their work that they're supposed to do as part of the order. Spend time meditating, contemplating, being in contact and in communion in a relationship with nature and with God. Is basically build up your conscience and then listen to it. They go hand in hand. It's incomplete without. And you could see how the incompleteness leads to that suffering.
We have a strong relationship to St. Francis. I really feel like Francis is one of the patrons of our grove. In fact, we call our grove itself the Seraphic Grove in honor of him and his work and his teachings.
Francis is one of those fun answers. When the Imperial Church comes along and somebody using Christ's name tries to claim you're a pagan doing all this pagan stuff, you're doing witchcraft and you're evil, and they want to just judge by that, I just sit back and I go, St. Francis was an early Christopagan. Sometimes it just evokes more outrage because the devil that's already in them is showing itself even more, because the devil doesn't like to have truth in their face, which of course evokes even further fight. But I am not scared to fight the devil. The
It's a lie.
devil is a lie. The others, it suddenly makes them stop and realize, oh, you're right, because St. Francis is an early Christopagan.
I don't see another way around it.
There isn't.
I really don't, because you and I have talked about this for a long time. And the way he incorporated the local beliefs, the way he incorporated nature, to me, paganism is earth-centric spirituality. That call yourself a pagan, you don't have to have a vast pantheon of gods. You don't have to have even really a connection to the old ways, though I think that that's helpful. To me, paganism is an earth-centric spirituality. If you are dedicated to the earth and dedicated to the grace and the goodness that comes from that connection to the earth, then you are a pagan. And that's not just me saying it. If you actually pay attention to those who rail against paganism, that's their argument as well. And they consider everyone who works for ecological justice a pagan, because that's earth worship.
As a Christian, when you read that whole passage, God put us here as stewards of the earth. It's all being about that right relationship with the earth, with the animals upon it. That's paganism.
That is.
It is. It just is.
The Canticle of the Sun is the greatest pagan prayer I have ever read. It is an invocation of the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, the water, the fire, the wind. It is an invocation of all of creation to aid us in our lives and in our journey down the road. And we really should do an entire episode on this at some point. But I would even say that a lot of his work is very witchy, because here's the thing. For those of you who are not familiar, and again, we should do an entire episode about this at some point, but that whole suffer not a witch to live stuff from the scripture, we actually don't know what that's referring to. The actual word there means snake priestess, and is probably dealing with a very specific practice that we don't even know exactly what was now. It's also important to realize that most of the admonitions against witchcraft were ways of controlling women and controlling people outside of the Imperial Church's control. Witchcraft was essentially defined as any folk practices that you had prior to or in spite of imperial control, and anything that took your focus and faith away from the institutional church. So the cunning folk were called witches. If you practiced folk magic or folk healing, you were called a witch. If you were a midwife, you were called a witch. If you brewed beer.
If you were a female entrepreneur brewer who brewed too much beer for the household and wanted to sell some to your village, you were declared a witch. That's what that comes from.
That's one of the reasons we talk about witches flying the broom, because everyone made their own beer at home back in the olden days, and it was the wife's to make the beer. And if she had too much, it was time to start the next batch, because You didn't have to control over that. When the grain came in,
Yeah.
that's when you made the batch. You would hang your broomstick over your door to let people know we have too much. If you need some, come here.
Yeah. I've got extra. I can
And
trade.
I mean, like I said, we could do an entire episode on this.
Yeah.
But when I look at the folk practices of Francis and how connected and rooted he was in the people, when you read all of the folk stories that come around after him, the Little Flower of St. Francis of Assisi is basically a collection of folk tales. Here are all the stories that people are telling about Francis. I don't want to say he was the Druid of the woods because he was Italian and that's a Celtic idea, but he was the wood witch who would just show up in town and heal people and scare off the wolves.
Yeah.
Have conversations with the wolves and make them leave. He's very much shown as that wise figure in the woods.
In addition to that, when you're reading through his writings, he does dream work.
Yeah.
You can't read that and not tell me that's, or if you want to, please in the comments. I'm curious to have a conversation because tell me that is not dream work. Tell me that's not meditation or the other spirit work that's done.
You're right. Francis really encourages us to connect very personally to spirit. The one thing that has survived in Franciscan theology beyond him is seeing the humanity of Jesus. Because it's easy for us to get lost in the divinity, but to remember that he was a real person. He was a human being who had aches and pains from sleeping on the ground, who had to walk from city to city to city to city, with the few exceptions of when he could get on a boat. And even then, boat travel was not the most comfortable. These aren't luxury liners. These are typically fishing boats going out across a vast inland lake.
Obviously encountered bad weather. Had to deal with that.
But to remember that humanity, this is anyone who picks up the name Christian has to realize that we are following the religion of a refugee. The earliest stories we have of Jesus is somebody who was driven from his homeland and had to seek refuge in Egypt, only to later wander back in when the threat was gone, and who spent his entire life on the outskirts of society. Francis speaks to these pains within all of us, this desire to be connected to something greater, when all of the forces of commerce and duty and society are telling us to be selfish, to think only of ourselves, to not consider what would be best for the world around us. Francis's entire life is a testament of how we can stand up to those forces and not only find grace for ourselves, but to help other people to find it as well. In the work he did with St. Clare, to the various churches that he founded, to all of the people that he fed. Every time you see a nativity scene, remember Francis started that. Francis knew that most of the people couldn't read, so he would bring people in to reenact the stories, because faith should be embodied. Faith should be about the here and the now, and not about the next or the later. Faith is now. Faith is about living that beautiful defiance, that wonderfully holy, rebellious life where you speak truth to power, which Francis did a lot throughout his life. And the early generations after him did as well. I think we're getting back to that in more modern times, especially with the Franciscans, but that got lost for a while there. When we're talking about the legacy of somebody like Francis, we have to acknowledge and really condemn the horrors that were literally done in his name with the Franciscan missions. I mean, true, terrifying horrors. Like, I've often thought, I would love to see some Native American filmmakers just turn those true stories into horror movies, because there are monsters in each one of those stories, one of which was not that long ago elevated to sainthood by the Catholic Church, because being tone deaf is kind of their thing now. But in everything that we do, we try to live in accordance with the work of St. Francis. We try to work in this way that honors all life, in remembering our brother sun and our sister moon and our sister mother earth.
His life story is such a great example to look at for not only inspiration, but also additional guidance. He started out in a place of opulence. His father was very wealthy, but it came at a cost. And not only is his life story a great example of how many face that struggle where they have to choose, do I sell out Or do I stick to my core beliefs and give up all of that that comes with selling out? Along with that, the thing that I really early on got out of Francis's life was how important it is to figure out what brings you joy in life. Figure out those core elements, because once you know what your core is, that can help you on the rest of your path. That lets you know what direction your feet should be pointing in. And the rest of the journey is just walking after that. The terrain will be what the terrain will be. But as long as you know what direction to point yourself in, and that comes from Francis, and from that, the early part in his struggle and his story. And sometimes you'll just charge ahead, and it's okay. Right? Spend some time building a church and that not be actually what you're supposed to be doing, but it's okay. You're still heading in that direction.
Before we even get to that, though, remember, his life story reminds us of the folly of the Imperial Church. Because when he felt his calling, be a knight unto the Lord, he got himself together and started marching off to join the Crusades, which were still going on when he was alive. And as he's going down the road, he very clearly hears the voice of God again. That's not what I meant. He, like so many people, got confused and went, oh, join the Imperial Church and build empire. And marched off to do that, and then learned very quickly, oh no, that is not what the actual calling is.
It's okay to do things. Like, to listen, you have to be able to pivot when it's time to pivot, because that's the thing. Don't be paralyzed by decision. Do things, take action, but be ready to pivot and listen so that you can find out real quick if you're on the wrong path, because, he pivots on that and then builds the church, that one church in that one town, like moving the physical stones and rebuilding like stone by stone, literally rebuilding a church, and then learns like, oh wait, okay, I was a little too literal. Let me pivot again, and pivots again. And it's such a wonderful lesson in life. Like right now, as we're in this time of pivoting and celebrating St. Francis, it's such a wonderful time to be reminded of both elements at the same time.
I started this episode saying, may we all fail as well as St. Francis. And if you don't know his story, a simple example. He gathered the brothers together and explained his version of the vow of poverty, that they should have owned nothing of themselves, that they should live like the early apostles did, with everything in community, living modestly, not eating too much, to be lived very, very simply. And then the community lavished upon them gifts of food and money. And this is the power of Francis that he really can teach us in our lives. He didn't see this as a temptation of the devil. He thought to himself, oh, look at all that we have to give, and started giving that extra food to the poor and spending that wealth to help people that were in need, and turned around and used it for good in his community and in his society. And every time he came up with a new, we should do this, and the world seemed to test his resolve on that, instead of, again, becoming defensive or doing what you hear a lot of modern Christians, that's a test of the devil. It just went, oh, so we have decided that we don't need all of this, but God is sending it to us anyway. How can we use this to help other people?
As we like to say in the Seraphic Grove, this is part of that law of returning tide in action, because like the tides, the wave comes in and you have all this abundance, right? All this water has rushed in, and that's okay. That's part of life. Put it where you need to put it, but put it back out. You don't try to trap the wave on the beach.
And it's going to carry back with it whenever it carries. It's going to be driftwood, sometimes a message in a bottle.
Yeah.
Francis is a amazing and glorious figure in our history and a great patron to our work. If you've never read anything by St. Francis, just look up the Canticle of the Creatures. It's a great place to start. His version of the Our Father is probably my favorite. It's usually titled St. Francis's paraphrase of the Our Father, which is beautiful and powerful and such a wonderful, wonderful prayer. Those may be some good places to start with his. If you can find a copy of St. Bonaventure's, either Legenda Minor or Legenda Major, those are his versions of the life of St. Francis. The Legenda Minor is the small version of the book that is meant to be read just a little bit every day. It's little meditations on the life of St. Francis. The Legenda Major, he tried to collect as many stories as he could about the life of St. Francis and tell his entire life story. Those are some great places to start. But yeah, if you're not familiar with this glorious and holy man, I highly recommend that you look into him, because I am not someone who likes to call any human being holy. I feel comfortable to say that about Francis because many of the stories about him include his foibles and his mistakes. And you don't see that in a lot, especially of medieval writings about the saints.
Another somewhat more controversial topic I would bring up amongst some of the Franciscans I used to hang out with was I like to think of St. Francis as Jesus Part 2. Just like a sequel, not as good as the first, but you know what? It's still a sequel, and it's still really good. I mean, and St. Francis is so much like that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
My feeling has always been that, 1,000 years after Jesus, we got Francis to try to remind us, to keep us steady on the course. And when that didn't work, we got Julian of Norwich to give us the gospel again. Hopefully now we'll listen. We should do an entire series on the Revelation of I Love, but that's a whole other topic for the future.
You can let us know in the comments.
Yeah. So what is your relationship with St. Francis? Have you ever had one? Is he just that guy that you've seen medals of in the pet store to put on your pet's collar? Is your only interaction with him those days that churches have their meetings outside so that you can bring your pets? Did you know any of this? And if you did, what is your favorite story about St. Francis? I think mine is Francis and the Wolf.
It's a great story.
Like, I think that's my personal favorite. Just
Mine's still his early adventures, the accusation from his father, the riding off to the Crusades and the church and all that, just because we won't ever know. But I almost want to be like the dude with ADHD. Bit of a joke around the house, always Brian does stuff, and I feel like I very much have that spirit of St. Francis where I just charge out and do things. And I'm working on developing the humility and the listening skills to help with the pivoting part of that. But picking up a thing and just charging off, oh yeah, right there.
And we all have the wisdom of St. Francis. Let us know in the comments. If you're listening to us on YouTube or on Spotify, you can leave a comment right there. If you're listening to us anywhere else, even if it says you can leave a comment, you can, but it will not notify us. So take that comment and go over to creationspast.com, click on chat. You can post it in there so we can actually see it. You can also connect with us on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky. We are Creations Paths on all three of those, and I've been posting quite a bit, actually, on those platforms lately. We'd love to connect with you. If you have a few dollars you can pass our way while you're over at creationspaths.com, you can join a membership over there. Members will get access to our classes early before everyone else, and you'll always have our great gratitude and thanks. We pray for our patrons, especially. That's not a perk. It's just often in prayer. I remember those and then say a special prayer because I feel like it's weird to say, give us money and we'll pray to you, pray for you. That's not really how it works. It's just in my gratitude. I often remember our patrons.
We'll pray no matter what. We'll just enjoy the extra food that we can have on the table.
Right.
And the lights and stuff.
Yeah, it really does help us to keep food on the table, power on, and a roof over our heads. If you want to support us anywhere else, you can go over to Ko-fi or Patreon. I am CE Dorset on both of those. So we are talking about maybe having a special Patreon and Ko-fi just for this. So Blessed Father, St. Francis, we ask that you will guide and guard all of us as we walk through the many challenges of life and help us to find the grace that exists in nature as you did, and to constantly find the great abundance for which we can give compassion and mercy to all those that we find in need. Amen.
Amen.